Welcome to the Mind.
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters.
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
Podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness.
Originals are nonconformists.
Creativity.
People who not only have new ideas.
Intelligence.
They're the people you want to bet on.
In childhood.
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
And beyond. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 37 of the Mind Matters Podcast. Today, we will be talking with Aurora Remember-Holtzman about the experience of being a gifted and intense adult. Aurora is a school psychologist, and she's also the host of the Embracing Intensity podcast. We will also talk with Michelle Benedict, who is a mindfulness expert and a twice exceptional adult. I think that you will find both of these insightful interviews really helpful as you work to understand your own experience as a gifted adult. If you happen to hear this episode right as it has been released, you might be prepping to head down to the World Council of Gifted and Talented Children Conference, or maybe you're going to EduFest next week. I will be at both, and I'll have some great Mind Matters swag. So if you're attending either, be sure to find me or Dave and say hey. I'll be talking about trauma and gifted kids at the World Council Conference in Nashville, and I'll actually be giving the opening keynote on stress and anxiety in gifted kids at EduFest in Boise. So I hope I get a chance to see you there. Also, if you haven't already subscribed to the podcast or left us a review, that would be a huge help and benefit the podcast if you would just take a quick minute to do that. Don't forget to find us on social media. We are Mind Matters Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and at Mind Matters Pod on Twitter. Up next.
Hello, I am Aurora Remember-Holtzman, and I am a school psychologist by day, and I host the Embracing Intensity podcast and community for gifted and outside-the-box thinkers.
Stay with us.
Previously on Mind Matters.
This is Jen Merrill from Laughing at Chaos and author of If This Is a Gift, Can I Send It Back?
I wanted to ask you about parent self-care for parents of gifted and twice exceptional kids.
There's a lot out there for gifted kids and for twice exceptional kids. There's nothing out there for their parents. Their parents are doing the heavy lifting. So my goal now is, my kids are getting older and I have more time to think, which is glorious, by the way, is to do more advocacy for the parents because they need it. I actually have a rule in my house. It's blood, bone, vomit, fire, flood, zombie. Unless one of those things are actively happening at that moment, you can handle it by yourself while I'm resting. Yes, you get to be selfish and take care of you, please.
Look for episode 33 wherever you get your podcasts.
Our first guest today is Aurora Remember-Holtzman, who is an example of a gifted adult and obviously also has the background to know the clinical side of things. Aurora, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on here. I've been a fan for a while.
So you're not only a school psychologist, but you are also the host of the Embracing Intensity podcast, which has been around and we've been enjoying for almost 3 years now. When we decided to do an episode on giftedness in adults, we thought that would be a great opportunity to have you on, not only because you are one, but also because you work with them. So let's start with this strange phenomenon of gifted kids, and they reach adulthood, and then losing that identity of giftedness. I talk to adults all of the time who got out of school and, they sort of forgot that they were gifted. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I think, we have that imposter syndrome piece that most of us have, I think. And our culture has this anti-intellectualism kind of thing. And it's hard enough to say my kid is gifted. People kind of look at you funny sometimes, and they think it's a braggy thing when we all know it's not. But then I think when you say it out loud as an adult, people see it as arrogance, and they don't want to sound like they're full of themselves. And then I think there's also the additional challenges of, asynchronous development that you see in kids transitions into adulthood as well. And so I think sometimes when we have these areas of strength and these areas of weakness, it's hard for us to really accept the gifted part.
And there's also, I feel like, this conversation sometimes about even like people question the legitimacy of IQ testing. And so then if you get into that, it's like, well, I didn't, like you said, that imposter syndrome, like I probably didn't even really deserve to be in that program in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a much different experience for adults. And I know that, you're able to talk to a lot of people who kind of have that intense, gifted adult experience on your podcast. What brought you to wanting to really share those stories?
Well, there's my own personal experience and my kid who is now 11 when he first went into school. And it's funny because I think the other thing about the gifted label is that sometimes as we get older, especially if we have things like executive functioning issues that get in the way, as a school psychologist, I've observed that sometimes our overall score actually goes down over the years. So I had that personal experience being tested as a kid versus tested in college. And so those executive functioning pieces get in the way of our intelligence sometimes, like our overall score.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean you're not gifted anymore. It just means that there's more of a gap between your skills sometimes, at least in my case. As far as my interest goes, my son, when he started in kindergarten, was having some, he's always been super intense from the day he was born. Like first time he nursed, we made a little exhalation and he popped off and looked around the room.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't even nurse in public because he was too interested in everything that was going on around him. And so when he went into school and he was having some behavior issues in school, I started looking up behavior issues in the gifted because I suspected that he's got very multi-generations on both sides. And so I discovered the term overexcitability from a variety of sources, but mainly Jade Rivera's blog post on it. She has a series of blog posts on it. And it just struck me that this was me as well. And one of the things I realized is in the school setting, we are starting to teach self-regulation in some schools. We are doing groups, we're doing class, people are going into classes. They're doing a variety of self-regulation type activities like zones of regulation and things like that. But as adults, we never had that. We never really learned about self-regulation and that sort of thing. And so that's what brought me to want to work with adults and help with the self-regulation aspect of it. And now I'm kind of looking at the brain, the whole brain, understanding and finding our strengths, our learning strengths, and using those.
I think there's also a carryover of that expectation of potential that we have as kids, like, oh, you have this label,
mm-hmm.
You're in this program, you're this, everyone has praised you for your intelligence or whatever the case might be, and then what if I don't live up to that?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, they tried to kick me out of the gifted program in high school. And I was actually one of only 2 people who'd been there since the middle school program that was very small. And so I knew going in that I was different than even the kids in that program.
Mm-hmm.
And then they tried to kick me out for underachievement. So I'm a big advocate in the school system for looking beyond achievement and acknowledging that the kids that need the most help are probably not the ones that are achieving high. Those kids do need it and they need support, but there's a big need for those people, both kids and adults, who feel like they're underachieving in some way.
It's like if you're not the next Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, that's somehow not good enough or something.
Yeah, I think a big pattern I see is that a lot of people will pursue an achievement based on what they think they should be doing, and they go down a track that they think they should be following because that's the track that makes sense from a societal standpoint. And then at some point in their life, they realize that maybe that's not really what's fulfilling to them. And so when it comes to underachievement, I think there's 2 aspects of it. There's underachievement from the outside perspective of people seeing someone and saying, oh, I don't think they're living up to their potential. And then there's the internal underachievement of pursuing maybe something that's not so satisfying.
That reminds me of that concept of multi-potentiality. there are some people who, as they pursue a career, are able to go down a certain path because that really is their strength.
Mm-hmm.
But with gifted people, a lot of times there are many paths that they could go down, and they're maybe they are listening more to that societal piece as opposed to that internal emotional drive.
Yeah, and the multi-potentiality thing, that's something I personally struggle with a lot because I have so many branches that I'd like to be working on, and I'll kind of branch out on all these different directions, and then I have to kind of rein it back in,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the reasons why I recently did a survey, because I'm like, okay, I have all these thoughts and ideas of what I could be doing, but I should probably get feedback on what people want from me, because I could follow any one of these paths, and they're all really cool.
Yeah.
But I think of it like pruning a tree.
Yes.
And so I will have periods where I just have all these branches going everywhere, and then I have to kind of back up and prune the tree and really narrow down just a couple areas to focus on.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's that seeking of novelty, a new idea, and it's really energizing to go and seek that out. I think that's part of that openness to experience or that intellectual intensity.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it's hard to, you use the perfect word, prune those things down to narrow them down, because it means you have to give up on something.
Yeah, well, and one of the things I just recently accepted for myself is that I was really narrowing my focus on a couple of things because of my work schedule, and now I have a little more time to expand, but I had totally given up on one creative project of, just making like merchandise type stuff. It's just silly, totally silly. It's not really an area that's going to be bringing in a whole lot of income. But what I realized when I dropped it is that it was the one thing I had that I could do mindlessly. And just when I'm tired at the end of the day and I don't have a lot of mental focus to work on constructive things. And it was a creative outlet in a way that the other things weren't. And so I allowed myself to spend some time on that because it's productive in its own right. It's not going to make me a lot of money. It's not going to, be any kind of groundbreaking thing, but it's fun and I can do it mindlessly.
For gifted adults, I think one of the things that I often hear from people is the difficulty that they have finding true peers. What are your thoughts about that topic?
Oh, that is definitely something I think I see a lot. I was super fortunate in my life because I always had that, and with family and community that my family tended towards. As I got older, I started just creating my own community. So in high school and college and various times, I kind of had to create that for myself because oftentimes you find yourself in a social situation where you feel kind of on the fringe of whatever that social situation is. But oftentimes you can find one or two people in those different settings that you connect with. And so, especially before we had massive Facebook messaging and stuff like that, I found one person who I really connected with through a group that I was involved in. And I would just we would come up with an idea and then we would just invite a bunch of people, and whoever showed up. And it was kind of beautiful because now that whole group has an ongoing message thread of, hey, we're doing this, want to come? Hey, we're doing this. That's been my experience. But yeah, I definitely see that in a lot of communities. And I feel like the people who didn't have that growing up or who haven't seen an example of it have a hard time believing it exists. I think the harder part is, especially if you're an introvert, what it took for me to create my own community was a lot of work. And as an introvert, that would be even more.
What does the research say? Something about, it's not a huge majority, but something like over 60% of people who are cognitively gifted are also more introverted.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the thing about gifted ed programs in general is giving kids the opportunity to be with like-minded peers, because it's hard sometimes to connect. It's like if I'm thinking about things 2 or 3 years ahead of what my peers are, and I'm conceptualizing them different. I have different interests. It's hard to establish those relationships. And you mentioned that like if they didn't experience that when they were young, it's hard to then create it or find it as adults.
And you don't develop the skills.
Right.
It's such a delicate balance in my eyes when it comes to that being too much for other people. I feel like for me, when I have experienced someone as feeling a little bit too much for me, it's usually out of some sort of insecurity, right? There's like this like overcompensation feeling. And I think that was something I experienced moving into my adulthood, going from a teenager who did everything I could to be way out there. And it was, I did things specifically for the attention, just to be, out there. And then as I moved into college and I got into a relationship with someone who, when we met, we were both on that like super weird end, but we kind of toned down for maturity's sake. And then I think took it a little bit too far in terms of the toning down aspect of it.
Right.
That balance of what intensity is a core part of who you are and is something that you really want to express with other people. And are there aspects of it that we're doing just kind of for the sake of being out there and gaining attention and that sort of thing?
Yeah, like what is the motivation behind it? Is it the phrase that you used, being too much for other people? Like the volume is just up too loud, and finding where that balance is depending on, who you're around, but still being true to yourself as well.
And I think what I've come to realize is the key for me is boundaries. I enjoy a vast array of people, but when I set a boundary and they don't respect it or that sort of thing, that's when I start to have issue with it, is when people start to cross boundaries. And I think sometimes you have to be much more clear and articulate with boundaries. And sometimes we don't necessarily want to verbally set those things because we don't want conflict or that sort of thing. But I think as an intense person, both setting your own boundaries and really respecting other people's boundaries, I think is probably the biggest thing for me.
I think that some of the other characteristics that we talk a lot about with younger gifted kids, but then somehow people forget about them as adults is, like the perfectionism and, the existential awareness and depression, which I feel like really doesn't go away, but somehow do you feel like people are ignoring it more, or do they find a way to kind of integrate it into their daily lives, or how do people handle that aspect of their internal life?
I definitely don't think it goes away. I think that internalized perfectionism and that existential need to make a difference in the world, I think that's a constant balancing act for most of us. I think we, especially right now in the world, like there's just so much going on, and we look at how can I make a difference? And then you feel small and insignificant. And then it's hard to know, like you either drive yourself to the point of burnout, or sometimes just throw your hands up and think, I don't think I can make a difference. And so I'm going to do nothing.
Yeah.
And finding something in between is a big challenge, I think.
When you think about intensity and burning the candle at both ends and not knowing which parts of your life should be pruned, you want to keep going, but you get that feeling that you just don't really have anything left. So, what do you do?
One thing I really have been more aware of over the last few years as I've been doing this work is energy balance, like where we're putting our energy. And I think on a fairly regular basis, I kind of have to look at where am I spending my energy, and are these things energizing to me or are they draining to me? And obviously we're going to have some things in our life that are draining that we can't cut out of our life, but we also have to make an effort to include the things that are energizing to us. And that's going to be different for every person, but finding ways to minimize those draining things as much as possible and adding in the things that energize us, I think, is a big factor for me.
So if people are interested in going the community route, you have a really cool one. Tell us a little bit about Embracing Intensity.
So it's embracingintensity.com. I'm working on a couple things coming up. So I'm looking at doing a mastermind group in the fall, and so that you can meet with a small group of people and really focus on your goals. Because one of the things that came up in the conversation I had yesterday with someone wanting to learn more about their brain and was talking about self-imposed deadlines and how it's really hard for us sometimes to if it's not an external deadline, right? How that perfectionist thing you said, we put things off till the last minute because then when we do it in a rush, it's not going to be perfect. And we know that because we did it in a rush and it was last minute.
Yeah.
And I personally have had to set some internal deadlines for myself that aren't, someone else imposing it. And what I find is really helpful is having that accountability piece of a group to say, hey, this is what I'm going to do. This is when I'm going to do it. And so that's one of the things I'll be starting in the fall. And I'm also looking at possibly some stuff around befriending your brain. Really looking at incorporating more of the school psych aspect for adults to understand how we process information and our strengths and weaknesses and that sort of thing.
Aurora Remember-Holtzman, founder of EmbracingIntensity.com and host of the Embracing Intensity podcast. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
My name's Michelle Benedict, and I am an educator, and I work in the area of mindfulness, specializing in mindfulness, and I'm a gifted adult.
We're talking about gifted adults and intensity in gifted adults. People are identified as gifted as kids, and then all of a sudden they graduate high school and that label, like they drop that label. But really, cognitively, they're still the same. Like that giftedness doesn't go away. What do you think influences that?
I think that people have the perception of, like, they're smart, they'll get it, it'll be fine. They don't really need any more support because they think smart is enough. And smart, it goes with a whole lot of other things, that fast processing, that intensity, and the affective needs, especially emotional needs that go with being smart. Because there's a quote that I love that basically says the world is full of smart people with doubts and idiots who have confidence. It's something like that, but I'm sure it's said much better. But yes, I think that smart people have so much doubt. So they need that support to kind of keep reaching and doing more with that cognitive ability. And I think that does get lost because people say, oh, they're smart, they'll be fine.
What was that transition like for you from, childhood into adulthood and where you are now?
Well, it was really interesting because whenever I was identified when I was a kid, then I moved in middle school. In 8th grade, I moved to a rural school that had no programming at all. So they didn't care that I was gifted, so it didn't matter. So I went from having a lot of support to that wasn't even a thing. Mm-hmm. So I think that it was hard for people to know what to do with me because I'm opinionated. I speak my mind. I am very intense, and I know this about myself, and I like that about myself now. I hated that about myself when I was young, that I felt like I felt everything really big and that everything just seemed intense to me, just even feeling it. So I can only imagine how it is for the people on the other side. But I just remember feeling misunderstood, and people are like, oh, that's okay. You're a teenager. That's how teenagers felt.
Well, and like Aurora spoke, she talked about that experience of gifted and intense adults having that feeling of being too much. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about.
Oh, yes, I'm extra. I've been called extra more times in the last 2 years by kids and adults. And that's the new phrase that they call people, or that I do too much. Mm-hmm. That's the other one. I do too much. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing is if I don't do that, if I'm not doing all that with that intensity, then I feel like I'm not doing it well. Mm-hmm. I'm not doing it as well as I could. Then I feel bad because I'm not doing my potential. So it's hard to find the balance between striving for my best, but not being too much for others.
Yeah.
And that's hard because I don't care that I'm too much for others sometimes, but I do want to fit in as a human. I want to be connected with others. So I wish that other people understood that let me go as far and hard as I want to and encourage me to do so, because you never know how far I can reach and what I can accomplish if I was more supported in that and less judged.
I know that one of the things I hear about from a lot of gifted adults is difficulty in finding like-minded peers, people who they can connect with, who get them, who don't feel like they're doing too much or that they're extra, or, what advice do you have for people who experience that, or how have you gotten through that?
Well, I think the hardest part has been close, intimate relationships, especially with like boyfriends and spouses. For me, that's been the hardest thing, is feeling like the comparativeness. And so I'm single right now, and that's okay. But I find that whenever I'm dating or whenever I'm making friends, it's kind of a one or the other, where I'm a 1 or a 0 whenever you like me. You either like me or you don't. And I haven't found a lot of people in between. There's not a lot of mediums. So I have had to just learn how to be okay with the zeros. And that was really, it took a lot of time in my 20s and 30s to really say, I really don't care that you don't like me. It used to bother me and I would work for that. And now I got to be me to be happy. And I have to, that intensity is me. And so I love with my whole heart. I hate with my whole heart. I do all those things in a big way. And I think that's the best part of being gifted. That's my superpower, is that intensity, because I do everything with my whole heart. I don't do anything halfway. And I think I hope that people, as they understand giftedness and understand that we don't grow out of it any more than a kid with autism, than a kid with ADHD, that this doesn't go away just because I'm taller and have a job. that if they would understand that I might be just a little bit different, but you can adapt to me just like we adapt to any other kind of person that has something that's special about them.
How do you make that intensity work for you?
That's really interesting, because I think I have to have like passions and pursuits, and I'm a big adventurer too. I have to be physically engaged in things, and I have to be very cognitively engaged all the time. So I have on a regular, 5, 6, 7 projects that I'm working on, and people are like, well, that's too much. And so whenever it is too much for me, I take my time. I know whenever I need a break from things. And this summer, for example, I was in a big transition from one job to another. I'm changing things again. And so I knew that I needed to okay, no more projects right now. I'm not doing that. But now I'm ready. I had my downtime. So I just learned that self-care. The other thing is I practice mindfulness every single day. And I also do some other things like exercise every day. And I do really monitor my sleep. And one of the biggest things that I've really worked on the last year is hydration. I didn't realize how much I would feel better if I was drinking more water. Yeah. So those kinds of things help you be more regulated. And that helps me notice my intensity better. Mm-hmm. Because if you're not aware, then you don't notice. And I try really hard to stay off that automatic pilot.
Tell me about how you came to mindfulness as an intense person. I feel like maybe intense people probably have a lot to gain from mindfulness, but maybe are often very resistant to it.
I agree. I think whenever I first started hearing about mindfulness, it just didn't sound like something that would do anything for me. Just sitting still. I'm not a sitting still kind of person. That doesn't make any sense. And it seemed so spiritual and religious from the way that it was always sort of presented in the world to me, because I grew up in a religious background. So those kinds of outside the norm types of things were not very accepted. But whenever I started learning more and more about the brain, that's how I came to mindfulness, is through that logical way, because that makes sense. Since I'm gifted, I like the logic part of things. And I did the research, and it was more about memory and not as much about emotional control. I was like, oh, I want kids to remember what I taught them. And so I thought that would be what I'd gain from that. But it really was the whole gamut of emotional regulation and self-awareness and the ability to check myself a little bit better with that intensity. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like my relationships over the last few years have gotten way better with everyone, because I know I still have that intensity, but I also know when to be quiet. And that's a new thing for me. I'm not going to lie. That's new in the last 5 years. I used to just say it and I didn't care how it came out in your ears. But now I feel like I'm that awareness has helped me build a better filter for that intensity for others.
So you feel like having that reflective piece for yourself and becoming more regulated allows you to hear other people better.
Yes. And I think whenever I'm not in one of my moods, that I'm not going to care about my filter, because I do still have those moods, because I'm still me. But I think they hear me better too, mm-hmm. because I'm able to not just say it with that loud intensity feeling that I have, and say it with love and a little more filter.
Yeah. Some compassion.
Yes. That was the word I was looking for. Yeah.
So, Michelle, one of the other things I know about you is that you're twice exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
And so in addition to being gifted, you have that diagnosis of ADHD. That's part of the reason why we click. So there are certain definitely characteristics. I would say that a lot of times people who have ADHD also have a lot of intensity. I think that that is a common theme with that. And so sometimes that can mean jumping from project to project, or sometimes as adults, job to job. How do you think that influences your intensity, having that kind of double-edged sword of that twice exceptionality?
Well, I think it really, really influenced how I got to here, because I did go from job to job. I did go from relationship to relationship because I didn't understand myself, because I didn't understand how I was coming off to others, and I didn't take the time or have the awareness and the openness enough to listen to others as well as I do now. So I think it was a journey. Also, one of the wonderful things about this, and we talked about this, is that whenever you do those jumps, it's amazing what you figure out that you can do. Like, I'm so glad that I've done all those things, because I never knew I had the capacity to learn some of the things that I've learned, or to achieve things in areas I would have never, ever, ever thought I could. And so that's helped me. I don't know. I think sometimes it's made me a little more intense, because I do have so much perspective, and I can't give that perspective to other people. And that's the trickiest part about this new awareness, is like, how do I ride the line of, yes, I know a lot of stuff, and I've had a lot of experience, a lot more than your average 41-year-old. And so how do I talk to my other peers without sounding like condescending or arrogant? And that's hard, because that's what people perceive my intensity as.
Right. It's not like I'm not trying to tell you that you're wrong, but I listen to all of these experiences and these things that I know, and I'm just trying to help you understand where I'm coming from. And it doesn't come across that way.
It really doesn't. And I think some people think I'm a know-it-all, and it's literally not that at all. It's just, if a wise person told me their experience because they'd lived longer or harder than I had, then I would listen. I love talking to older people for that reason. But I know what I've lived through, and I know how I've gotten to this point. And so I kind of feel like maybe because I'm my age, people don't think that I have. But if you know me, and once you get to know me and you know that I've had these experiences and done a lot of things, 17 industries is what I've worked in, that's what I told you. And I've been married twice. And so I've had some experience, and and I'm only 41, and my kids are almost grown. Again, that's a big experience to have at 41. So I think all of those things have led me to understand that it's not just the world has to adjust for me, that I do have to adjust, but I do want the world to adjust a little for special people. And I want people to understand that this is special too. And it's not just that I'm smart enough to get through it, that sometimes I need different kinds of support than you would give to someone who maybe didn't have that as their barrier.
It sounds like you've kind of had a real path, though, of recognizing where you fit in that, but also honoring who you are without giving it up.
I think that's been hard, because when I was younger, I would conform. I would conform a lot more than I do now. But I think as I've gotten older, I've realized that doesn't make me happy when I try to be like what they want me to be, or to conform into the rule or box. I don't have a box, so don't try to put me in one. And I think as long as I have that common understanding with the people that I spend time with, and even my employers, I usually have to have that conversation like, hey, I'm going to kind of be a little bit more of a risk taker whenever I do things. So if you see something, they're like, oh, Michelle, just rein me in. That's when you rein me in. But I'm always going to try new things, because that's what I do. I like to do that. As long as I have those conversations with people that I spend a lot of time with, then we're fine. But it's strangers and people who meet me new that I need some work in that area, and I'm still working on that.
What advice would you give other adults who are gifted and intense, if there was something that you could tell them about finding their place or their community or themselves? What would you want them to know?
I think that whenever you do the things you love the most and you really pursue those things, you become the best version of yourself, and then nothing can stop you. I really believe that if you step into that part of you and don't care about those judgments, that's when you're the best version. And I feel like right now, even though I'm wholly flawed, I will never say that I don't have lots of flaws. I feel like I'm the best version of me right now.
Michelle, thank you so much for being with us today.
No problem. I was excited to do it.
It's a mistake to think that giftedness is something that goes away with age. Time and again, research has shown that cognitive ability is one of the most stable and measurable attributes of human development. It's much easier to advocate for our kids to receive the things they need at school than it is to recognize and self-advocate for our own needs. One thing about being a gifted and intense adult is that we aren't limited to peers based on a calendar year and what grade we're in, like when we were at school. But it can still be hard to find that community. I know that I'm grateful for the friends that I've made through the podcast and through social media, because technology has widened that circle of people who are available for me to call friends. Humans are social creatures. We crave connection and community, and we need to feel like we're understood. Finding others who embrace their intensity like you do can be the key. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and I will see you next time on Mind Matters.
Well, don't it seem like a drag? Oh, like putting all of your joy in a big brown bag.
We'd like to thank Aurora Remember-Holtzman, host of the Embracing Intensity podcast, and we encourage you to add it to your subscription list. Her website is embracingintensity.com. Our thanks to Michelle Benedict, our mindfulness expert, who reminded us all of an inner truth.
I got to be me to be happy.
The executive producer of Mind Matters is me, Dave Morris. And for Emily and all of our Mind Matters commissary, chefs, and wait staff, thanks for listening. Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.